Good afternoon, quarantiners, and welcome to Stuck Together, Stuck Apart, Family Success During Quarantine. I am Erik Thompson. Can you see me? What's happening? For some reason, my video is... Well, we'll just roll ahead. So yes, we have all been thrown the global quarantine curveball, testing our flexibility. And I'm glad to have you with us here today to explore that flexibility with Dr. Kathleen Smith on the topic of quarantine anxiety, which is a significant factor in our capacity to be mindful as the ball is curving and keep our eye on the ball, not with it. And I just wanted to tell you, today is my mom's 82nd birthday. And I went to visit her today with my daughter in the assisted living facility where she lives, and she had a big smile on her face. The place is amazing at handling relationships. And I will mention, just a quick pause here, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you might want to go up into the top right corner of your Zoom screen and choose speaker view rather than the gallery view, and then you'll see a larger image of the person who's talking. So anyways, back to my mom. I was reflecting on it because we have our 24th annual symposium coming up. And on our first symposium 24 years ago, I did a presentation called One Argument, A Family Systems View, which is about an argument I had with a mother, which was my mother, and my exploration of my journey from thinking that what was annoying me about my mother was mostly about her, to the discovery that I had a tremendously large role in all the things that were going on between my mother and I that were annoying me. And including the weakness in my capacity to define myself to her. And so I told about that 24 years ago. And I'll tell you that work has really paid off for me. I was courting at the time my current wife, and all the same skill set that I discovered that I was lacking with my mother ended up being foundational to the stable and satisfying marriage that I've managed to pull off. So just honoring my mom, I have a relationship with people who know about ancient wisdom traditions and family. And I'm interviewing them. And I asked one of them recently, what do you know about the multi-generational relationship? And they said, well, there's an ancient idea that if you want to cultivate your heart and have a more refined heart, one of the best ways to do it is to take care of the older generation. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I love that idea, but it's tricky. Sometimes it's tricky to take care of the older generation when the relationship's kind of tangled up. And what does it mean to take care? So welcome to the Vermont Center for Family Studies, where this meeting is sponsored by Pomerleau Real Estate, to whom we are very grateful. The Vermont Center for Family Studies is here as a resource in this community, Vermont and beyond, to help families out, lend a hand, strengthen families, mostly by training professional advisors in this wonderful body of knowledge, Bowen Family Systems Theory. And today, I'm very pleased that we have with us as a guest Dr. Kathleen Smith. Dr. Smith has degrees from Harvard and George Washington University. She has a vibrant practice as a therapist in the DC area. She's on the faculty. She's an associate faculty for the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family. And I can tell you that is not an easy thing to pull off. You have to know a lot to be able to get that title. And you have to have lived the ideas. And she's a writer. She has been, you can read her in publications like Slate, New York Magazine. Gosh, I'm forgetting some. Psychology Today, a lot of publications that you've heard of. And also, you may have seen, if you came in a little early here, I'll share the screen and just show you again the book that she's recently released, Everything Isn't Terrible. And it is a book with a great deal of wisdom in it and also humor. It's an interesting combination of depth and humor. And I'm just going to give you a little taste of that. She writes, talking about the alarm systems, the kind of smoke alarm systems that are built into humans that we share with other animals, and how we are different than other animals in terms of how our alarm systems go off. She writes, most organisms have some or all of these built-in responses to anxiety and fear and threat, which she has listed, responses to danger, but we humans are special. Not only can we sense danger, but we can imagine potential danger. Your dog doesn't worry about whether you'll feed him tomorrow. He only wants to know if you're going to finish that piece of cheese. So she got me chuckling throughout this book. And with that, I like to bring in Dr. Smith.
Thanks, Erik. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes?
I can.
Awesome. Well, I'm so happy this is a conversation we're having today and not just me is presenting for an hour. I don't know if I've maintained that ability or not in these anxious times. So I'm happy to have you chatting with me as well as we think about these ideas. And I was thinking about, it's funny that you just pulled that quote, because I've been thinking about how humans aren't special and how wonderful that Bowen theory brings that idea that we're not mystical creatures. How we respond to anxiety is predictable, it's knowable, it's universal, and that is a gift, I think, in these times to not be surprised by what you do, what you normally do, and what your family does when there's distress. And that, at least for me personally, that has been a great resource and a great comfort to me, to not be shocked when I do what I always do, in the past month when the stress has been dialed up.
Wow. Yeah. How's your family doing, Kathleen?
Yeah, I have a very small family that I live with. It's just my husband and my toddler daughter, who is completely unaware that anything has changed. And so that is, not the burden that other parents have of children who sort of know what's going on and they're missing their friends or not. Having an 18-month-old who's, pleasantly surprised by everything is pretty easy right now.
Is you're 18? Oh, Kathleen, we can hear you, but I don't think we can see you. Is your video turned on?
Yeah, it's turned on.
I think we may be facing a global Zoom rush right now, because I use Zoom all the time and my Zoom is behaving a little strangely. And so wait, now I see you, but it's frozen. But that's okay. Your voice is conveying a lot, so we're going to just roll with this. Yeah, so I was just curious, your observations of your 18-month-old, and how does an 18-month-old get affected by something like this, global quarantine?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about me anxiously focusing on her and what, we were reading a book this morning about like going to the grocery store, and I suddenly had this panicked thought of, oh gosh, like, does she remember what a grocery store is? Is she going to be impaired by, not being able to go to these places for 6 months, or however long this will go on? And then of course I immediately thought after how, me having that fear is so much worse for her than the reality of not going to a grocery store for a while, and I think that that's what we're up against, right? The the fear of the neglect or the unusual circumstances, and forgetting that we're actual, capable creatures, including our kids, right? And how that prevents me from being more objective and realistic about, how well she's doing.
Yeah. Wow. That's such an interesting point. The power of that relationship. And probably nobody on this call is shocked by the notion that your daughter's physiology and neurophysiology is probably affected by yours. Mm-hmm. So, well, I'm delighted to have you here today. Thank you for coming. And I'm sincerely really enjoying the book, and not, I do like funny books, but this book has so much clarity in it mixed with the humor, and that combination makes it unique. So thanks for all the work you must have done to get that book. How many hours did you put in, Kathleen? Did you track it?
Well, it's actually terrible timing because it was due a couple months after my daughter was born. So that entire period is a complete blur to me. Right? It's amazing I could put together any sentences at that point. So I can't answer.
Thinking about quarantine anxiety.
Sorry?
I just said, what are you thinking about quarantine anxiety?
Yeah. So can I share my slides? Yeah. Okay. I don't know if people will be able to see it or not.
You should be able to.
Okay. It says host has disabled screen sharing.
All right. Hold on. We can fix that.
They're not in great detail, so I'm happy to just read them and share them with people later.
Let's see these slides. I can fix that. I'm going to make you a co-host. Just bear with me one sec here. And your video is online now. So.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. People see it? Nod if you can see it. Awesome. All right. So, when this first started, one of my first thoughts was, always one of my thoughts in dealing with bone theory and anxiety is, how do I be objective about how well I'm doing, and how much of my actions are driven by my thinking or driven by my desire to calm things down as quickly as possible, right? To just manage the anxiety. And I think being isolated, not having access to other people's perspectives and reactions was really going to limit my ability to be objective about how well I was doing. And so I wanted to come up with some sort of system to evaluate how I was doing that could help me sort of move a little bit closer towards maturity, towards thoughtfulness, towards being more differentiated, whatever you want to call it. And the practice that I kind of developed out of that question was to ask questions, because I think it's very difficult for me, and I think for a lot of people, to generate good questions in the midst of distress, right? But if you have those written down, if you have them available to you at the start of the day, or to kind of grab when you're feeling a little overwhelmed, I think that can be really useful for people as a tool, to be able to kind of tease out my best thinking and have it as a reference for myself when I was starting to panic about my work or my family or how other people were behaving, right? Criticizing other people's behaviors, all the things that we're trying to do right now, or we end up doing if we're not paying attention, right? And so, when I encourage clients to generate questions for themselves, the first thing I ask them to do is just to make a list of their anxious behaviors. And that could be sort of things they see themselves doing, patterns they see within their families, right? And a lot of these are going to reflect, those Bowen theory concepts and the ideas in the emotional process, right? The distancing, the focus on a kid, over-functioning, under-functioning, conflict, all of those things, right? And so being able to kind of have a predictable list of, if you dial up the anxiety, these are the things that are going to start popping out in my behaviors. I think the benefit of that is twofold. One is that I think it helps you be less critical, and you beat yourself up less about it. You kind of just see it as, okay, this is what I do to sort of relieve the anxiety of the moment, for better or worse. Sometimes it works really well. Sometimes it doesn't. None of these things are probably sustainable over the long term. And once you can kind of generate a list of those behaviors, flipping them, asking what the opposite of them usually gives you kind of a guideline for being sort of a more mature person in this anxious time. So I wanted to just, if it's okay with you, I just wanted to share a couple of these things that I've noticed myself doing over the last month, and sort of behaviors that I've noticed in my family as well. And I'm just going to run through these real quick.
Great.
First thing is just the distancing, right? So reducing contact with my most anxious family members. I noticed that I have an aunt who has hearing trouble, and she doesn't like to talk on the phone very much, and she also wasn't being very vigilant about her health. And so sort of the recipe of those three things, I think, made for a very anxious conversation or relationship with her right now. And so I noticed myself began to call her less frequently. Our phone conversations will become shorter, right? And I wasn't giving myself the opportunity to practice managing my anxiety while I shared what was going on with me and while I asked what was going on with her. And so I started to notice, what are those relationships where I'm beginning to distance? Or if I'm still talking to them, where are the conversations turning more superficial and less sort of fact-based about what's important to me and what's important to them? And then kind of the flip side of that is, when am I sort of over-focusing and beginning to direct or lecture family members, in particular those who are more at risk for developing serious complications from coronavirus? I noticed how quickly that happened right away and could definitely heard that from a lot of people as well. How quickly did I begin to instruct them about how the virus operates, or how they need to wear a mask, or how often they need to go to the grocery store, right? Or where to get their news and what news to trust, right? Before I even had done a lot of thinking about those things myself, I was already trying to direct others to do as I think, or as I've been told. And I noticed that as sort of an anxious behavior. The third thing, which I think a lot of us have been doing lately, is over-focusing on the negligent responses of others. I would be walking through the neighborhood with my husband and my daughter, and I would be pointing out things that we're doing that I thought were negligent, and it became really difficult to enjoy myself and to relax because of that anxious focus on everyone else's behavior, and that wasn't very useful for me. And again, spending more time criticizing other people's thinking than developing my own. We love to do this. And I think that it is difficult to develop your own thinking when you are very focused on everyone else's responses. You have to sort of set aside that time. The other things I started to notice were my relationship with my husband. Was I asking him for reassurance? I began to ask him things like, is it okay that I made this hair appointment for a month for now? I only wipe this down this way. Is that okay? Like, somehow he has this magic knowledge that I don't, right? And that I'm not equally capable of using my own brain. But, I was using that reassurance for him to manage my anxiety, my distress in the moment. And I think that frustrated him and also didn't help me develop my own thinking. And so I tried to kind of reel back on that very quickly. And then I noticed, because we were both working from home, that I began to become opinionated about how my husband should schedule his day, or when he should work, which we partially have to decide because of childcare, right? But I began to notice that I was sort of overstepping the boundaries of what was his responsibility and what was mine, so that overfunctioning. And then I already talked about this a little with Erik, but I noticed that I began to focus on my daughter's potential negative reactions and not her capability, to imagine this worst case scenario, or focus on the what ifs, as opposed to what the reality and what the challenges were today, not the what is this going to mean for her in the long term, but to ask myself, what is my responsibility as a parent today? How do I show up and activate that thinking in real time? And then the last one, which I think is a challenge for a lot of people, is I found myself vacillating between news binging and completely distancing from the facts. I noticed that I was binging a lot in the evenings, and that I think that for me, that is the absolute worst time to problem solve, is right before I go to bed. And so, I said, okay, do I need to sign up for this newsletter, that the Post is doing? Do I maybe just need to check the numbers for my area every day, or tune into the local news conference every now and then? I wanted to get specific about what I felt being responsible was, as far as knowing the facts, and what was me just anxiously focusing on it as a way of managing my distress, but which often increased it. So those are just a couple of behaviors I began to notice as I, just paid attention to what I do to calm the anxiety of the moment, and how those behaviors didn't reflect who I was trying to be, or who I am trying to be every day. So Erik, did you have any thoughts, or I don't want to keep rambling if you wanted to jump in?
Well, I don't think you're rambling. It's a very directed presentation, and I just think you've done a good job here of identifying many processes that are happening all across the country. So it's a social process that we're in, and these are very interesting points. One thing I was thinking about, on the resilience of children, I love your point there. Rather than seeing, we have a tendency to overdo perception of threat in our offspring, rather than seeing, like you wrote, their capability, or seeing their capacity. And one thought that I'm trying to keep in mind is, I think, a systems perspective of how viruses function in their symbiotic relationship with humans, is that our immune systems are tuned by contact with various threatening organisms. So they learn how to deal with viruses by having contact with viruses. And so I think one way to look at viruses in general is that they tune the immune system to prepare for the future. And that the children who, thank God, so few of them really globally are passing away from this. The ones who are going to get it, which will probably end up being a lot of them, may be protected, for the viruses that are to come. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a great list.
Yeah, it's funny. I use the analogy of immunity a lot with my clients when I talk about moving towards anxious family members and how I might not feel like it, but how that is sort of over time, the ability to manage oneself in contact is sort of a form of immunity, for better or worse.
That's a great metaphor. And of course, what would you rather have? No contact with a threatening substance or threatening individual in your family, or immunity from the problem? Immunity is a lot better. That's an interesting metaphor. Yeah.
Well, just to move on to the next to the next slide. So, if you're kind of creating a list of some of these behaviors or patterns in your family system, to ask yourself, okay, what do I do with this knowledge? What do I do with these observations? And at least what I have done is began to create questions that direct me towards a more thoughtful response, as opposed to the sort of the automatic one that I usually present in a situation. And so to just kind of give you a couple examples, One is, okay, if I notice myself distancing, reducing contact with anxious family members, then to just ask more questions about that. Okay, who are the people I'm going to probably avoid? What would it look like, or how can I make an effort to maintain emotional contact with them? And so, emotional contact being that one-to-one relationship, that sharing of beliefs, values, interests, not just the superficial, right? And, most importantly, how can I remember that the anxiety I feel will not kill me? That when, when I feel very allergic to them, or they bring out sort of that distress response, that it is something that I can handle. Those are just a few examples of questions that could come out of that behavior. And for the second one, if I'm finding that I'm lecturing people on how to stay safe, again, to ask, well, who am I probably going to lecture? How do I make space to hear their own thinking? What would it take for me to be able to do that? What does it look like to share my thinking without trying to control their behavior or control the reaction, right? I've had a lot of conversations with clients about this. How do you, because I think what people interpret, they interpret stopping the lecturing as not saying anything at all, right? And not sharing your own thinking. And I don't think that's true. The difference is how do you share that thinking while being responsible for yourself and not trying to be responsible for the other person and how they respond to it, right? And I think that's tricky. It's hard to do. But I think it's more useful for people, and people are better able to hear you if they sense that you're not trying to manage them, right? And so that has been a challenge for me. To give an example, I had a conversation with my grandmother who had gone to a flea market in Tennessee over the weekend. Of course, I hear this information, immediately my anxiety goes up, right? and I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to respond to this? Do I say nothing? Do I just pretend that it's not concerning, right? And so what I did, for better or worse, was I just asked questions. I said, how many people were there? What were they doing? What did you do? Did you feel safe? And I just kind of left it at that, and maybe I should have answered differently. Maybe I will in the future. But in that moment, that was my attempt to stay in contact with her without distancing, but also without trying to lecture her how to behave, because she's an intelligent, capable person who has access to the facts. And so I tried to remember that in that moment. And I think that helped me be able to talk to her and not be so anxious about it.
You're making me think of my relationship with my 17-year-old daughter, who, there's just a remarkable difference between how she responds to me when I am interacting with her in a way that respects her thinking versus that tries to direct her thinking. And you're also reminding me of my journey with my mom that I mentioned at the start. Many of those same points are there in that story. And I think, sometimes we try to substitute a defined self with things like telling someone else what to think. I would be more comfortable if they thought or acted differently. So my primary goal is to make myself more comfortable. So how am I going to do it? Get them to think differently. Mm-hmm. And that's just not a well-defined self.
Yeah. And I think that's another great question is what I'm doing about helping this person, or is it about calming myself down? And I think people will find that a lot of what we do has very little to do with helping in the moment.
Yeah, that's probably one of the great gifts in Bowen theory is the tools that are there in it to really tease out what's actually going on in very important high stakes relationships, and to be able to recognize the difference, really, like you just said, who's this really for? I'm appreciating how you've developed this discipline of asking questions. Does that terminology make sense to you, that it's a discipline you've developed?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it doesn't come naturally. And I think that, in other times, we're able to kind of get by most of the time with doing what we normally do, right? But if you dial up the anxiety, if you put everyone in close quarters, the wheels kind of fall off the wagon and these automatic things don't they cease to work at some point, right? So this is where you see these symptoms emerge, right? So I think that you have to make space and time to do it, because it won't come naturally to you in really anxious times. And to kind of move on to the next slide. So I think it's useful for people to ask what that looks like. How do you engage the front part of your brain? I mean, every week or ideally every day in a time like this? Is it, do you need a couple questions to start the day or end the day? You need some principles to kind of refer to when you feel distressed. Do you need to be meeting regularly with a therapist or coach to help you do this kind of thinking? I think all of those things can be very useful. But it takes effort and it takes time, but I think it can make such a huge difference.
And I like that last one. I like the wide open, curious nature of the last point. Any practice that activates your thinking or your best self. I'm reminded of a quote from your book that I noted. Dr. Smith wrote, "I truly believe," and this is getting to clinical practice, "I truly believe that the opposite of anxiety is curiosity. If I can stay curious about my therapy clients, they'll often do better." And I think, what you're talking about, I think I'm just thinking about the link between these practices with an aunt or a mother, as we've discussed, and clients, and how, like your daughter, they could be very powerfully influenced by a helper who is seeing them as not capable. And this is very common in the field of helping.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that curiosity helps you refrain from labeling anyone as the problem or as the villain or seeing yourself as the hero. You kind of just see the system for what it is and humans doing what they normally do. And I think that helps you be way more objective about yourself and everyone else when you bring that curiosity to it. But it's very hard to be
Can't
curious
see yourself as the hero. Not see yourself as the hero. Are you going to try to take that away from me?
I'm definitely not.
I want that. I want my cape, my Superman cape.
Right. Well,
I know you have another side, and I just want to note in a few minutes, 5 minutes or something, you've given us a lot to think about here. For those who haven't been on these calls, we have done this practice of giving the opportunity to go into a breakout room, and we'll be doing that shortly here for about, you'll get about 10 minutes. And the purpose of that in these web meetings is to really give people the opportunity to integrate some of what you've been hearing, the ideas you've been hearing, make them your own in whatever way that is truly your own for you. It's not so much to meet new people, and I've said to folks, I suggest, because the time will fly by, that you just skip the introductions, introducing each other and saying names. I suggest you just skip that and just dive right in. Let someone start by speaking about what they've been thinking about. Kathleen, do you want to introduce this slide?
Yeah, so this are just a couple questions I came up with. I think the first is the best. What has this got you thinking about? What behaviors that I mentioned or ones that sort of came to you when you were thinking about how you and your family system have responded over the past month? What has been pretty predictable, and knowable that if you are thinking about it, that sort of pops in your mind. And also,
I like your one about who am I most. It fits into your second question there. Who am I most likely to lecture? Yeah. Or avoid or distance from, maybe because they think differently about the threat level, for example. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, these are not complex questions. They're just it's just literally asking yourself, what have I done and how effective has it been? What has been the outcome? And is there a better way? Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of reflects that last question of what questions can I ask that help me, that are that better way, right? That bring more thoughtfulness, that bring greater maturity to the situation I find myself in. And it could be a question that's as simple as, how would I like to be responsible for myself today? You know, what behaviors do I need to avoid? You know, how would, you know, how am I going to be immature, and how do I give myself the best chance of interrupting that? You know, they're very simple questions.
So your last one there is a question about questions. Inviting people to, and you could use some of this time now if you're drawn to it, to see if you can articulate some questions for yourself, as Dr. Smith has done for herself. All right, well, this seems like a good moment to move towards the breakout. And I want to suggest, if you want to just take a moment, those on this meeting, to look at these questions, and you could grab a pen and just see which one intrigues you the most. And because you'll probably only have a chance to really address one of them in the moments that you have here. And of course, I'll highlight too, you obviously you don't have to interact in your breakout if you want. In fact, you even have an option within Zoom to leave the breakout meeting if you prefer. So it'll probably just take me a minute here to move you folks into breakouts. And Kathleen, would you mind stopping sharing your screen?
Yeah, how do I, okay, there we go. I'll stop. There we go.
All right, just give me a second here, folks. And okay, now you will go into the breakout rooms.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Pardon?
Yes.
All right, the three of us.
Right.
Let's see.
Four of us.
There's more than three.
Or whatever, I start to get curious about their intentions and their motivations, and that doesn't seem like a particularly healthy way to be curious.
Kind of like, why is it that you're so overreactive? Like that kind of, so we were talking, Rebecca and I, about lectures disguised as curiosity. And by the way, I just want to mention, Rebecca Massini is one of the presenters at our symposium, which is on Friday, June 5th, coming up. You can register for that online. I'm very excited about this morning, which will be 9 to 12:30. We got about 7 presentations. Rebecca's going to present about Stoicism and Bowen theory. She's a longtime student of Bowen theory and a teacher of it in the Columbia Theological Seminary. And also Dr. Smith will be back with us. She's going to talk about clinical practice with young adults using Bowen theory. And I just particularly want to highlight this story that's going to get told during that meeting, which is called The Mattress Fiasco. And it's a very clearly written story about the kinds of processes that we've been discussing here, where a person examines an important emotional process between themselves and siblings and presents a differentiating effort on that. Kathleen Smith, how was your breakout room?
It was great. We talked about curiosity as well, and how someone brought up being curious about triangles, which I think is not the easiest thing to do when you're in the middle. And I think we also talked about how difficult it can be to be curious about clients right now, when everyone is just throwing so much reactivity at us and things feel very heavy and challenging. And I know for me personally, people are in the house, right? They're talking about people who could overhear them, right? So the anxiety is way up. And how do you stay curious and ask really good questions, and how useful that could be for somebody to have that in a conversation?
We have about 5 minutes now. If anyone who's been on this call would like to share a thought that got stimulated by this discussion, that's something you could do right now. If you just raise your hand, or you can use the raise hand feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen. You have to go into participants and find yourself and raise your hand. Like to hear what you're thinking about. Just while I'm waiting for that possibility.
We have a few folks, it looks like.
Oh,
It says Margaret Markison raised hand.
okay. Let me see.
Yeah.
If I...
Hello?
Hi, yeah.
Hi, I just unmuted
What's on your
myself.
mind? Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking, I realized yet again how my lecturing tendency gets kicked in at this time through people who are obsessed with the media and keep talking about how upset they are and how they can't sleep because they're reading the news at night. And then I want to go into lecture mode and say, here's what I've done. And I'm so much happier, and you'd be so much happier too if you just, limited it to 5 minutes a day.
Yeah.
So an anxious response about, it's really my own anxiety, thinking about how to focus, dial it back.
Thank you. Who was the other person, Kathleen, who had their hand?
I'm going to be pronouncing your name wrong. Is it Eliane or?
You can go ahead and unmute yourself and share
Okay.
your thoughts.
I think I am unmuted. So unfortunately, I have to say that I missed a lecture. I was in a different meeting and couldn't get out. And I just got the little tailwind of it. So I'm from Canada, on the west coast of Canada. And I every time I sit with people who are thinking through the lens of Bowen theory, I'm always learning. There isn't a time I never learn. So I missed your lecture. I will watch it. But I got something out of two things that people said. One of them was yourself, Erik, around lectures disguised as curiosity. I think I might do that. And so it's going to give me some time to think about, when I'm going into teaching lecturing mode. And the other one was a participant who said something like, when I get curious about people's intentions and motivations and my energy goes towards that, that's just another way of other focusing, of putting the focus on someone else and not bringing, and so gathering it back and bring it to me. So so even though I was here for just about 5 minutes, I'm really happy to have been invited. Every time I come, I learn something. And it's making me think that I need to spend more time with people who think in Bowen theory, because it doesn't take long for me to go, yeah. It's kind of like I need that external community. So that's what I've been thinking about.
Speaking of spending time with people, one thing you could do is get Dr. Smith's book. And I also want to mention, just going to skip ahead here to, we're going to slow our web meeting schedule down, but we have a special guest coming on June 11th, Dr. Walter Smith. Those of you who are not aware of Dr. Smith, he is a very distinguished Bowen theory scholar. He has written a very unique work on child abuse that he spent many, many years refining, published it in our journal, the Bowen Center's journal, which is called Family Systems. And we're going to be just getting Dr. Smith's perspective on the quarantine and the social processes that he sees going on that meeting on June 11th. And then you can see the other meetings, which we'll be posting if you're on our mailing list this summer. And I also just wanted to highlight again the symposium on June 5th, and you can see there the panel of different speakers that we'll be having that morning. Probably be somewhat like this, really. It'll be probably end up being about the same size. You'll hear 9 different or 5 or 6 different 15-minute presentations and then some discussion in between. Well, we got a few more minutes. Maybe we should sit
Erik-
here and not say anything.
Erik,
Sure.
could I add one thing? I just wanted to let people know that if they wanted to learn a little bit more about sort of what I was presenting on, they can just go to my website, which is kathleensmith.net. And I've written about 5 or 6 essays in the last month or two, specifically about coronavirus related anxiety. So that's a free resource. That's a free resource that people can use if they're interested in thinking more about this. So
Thank you. Also to mention, we are really grateful again for the sponsorship of a local real estate company, Parmelo Real Estate, for these meetings. And they also sponsor the Meditation and Family Success Conference that we've called it different things, but that's my working title for this year, or you could say Differentiation and Higher Stages of Human Development. As another possible title that we're going to have in October. And also, again, that we have this training program, and we have a fairly simple application process that does ask you to define a few things to us. But if you have any questions about that training program, it meets in the mornings for 8 months in a row from fall and through late spring. And this is the time of year excuse me, to apply for that training program if you're interested in it, or to just reach out to us. Roz Saunders, our administrator, is really good at answering questions about it. Want to encourage you, if you are curious about it, to go ahead and reach out to us about that process, which involves a deeper dive and a sort of steady rhythm of exploration of how to apply these concepts. It's mostly for professionals, but a lot of the emphasis is on applying them for yourself, because that's the best way to learn it. Imagine living in a state of like really steady curiosity. Like, I'm just thinking, what if you stayed for one entire day and you were in a state of curiosity from the moment you woke up until the moment you died? You died. you went to sleep. You went to your little death, your nightly death. This is something to think about. It's just, it just interests me to think about how. I wonder how much of the average day, let's say the folks here on this call who probably tend to be very thoughtful, introspective people who are, in the helping profession have thought a lot about this. I wonder if we had some way of ever knowing how much time during the day we would spend in curiosity, how many minutes it would be.
I was going to say 10 minutes with a client would be a victory, Erik. I don't know. I have a pretty low bar.
10 minutes per hour with a client?
That would be great, I think.
Could be 10 minutes.
Yeah.
It could be some good value for your hour. And then how do we get that number up? I wonder if we are good at raising that number. I know I've gotten better. I have a guiding principle about an important person in my family, and let's wind down with this maybe, and one more comment from you, Kathleen. I was saying in my small group that I've figured out with one person in my family in particular that I deliver absolutely no value to the situation when I think I know what that person should be doing. And that it's quite striking to me, the difference between the way they respond to me when I approach them from, as you were saying, you're competent, and also curious. You're competent and I'm curious how you see the world. It's like a night and day difference. But as you were just joking, I really think it's not a lot of minutes that I spend in that my frame of mind. However, I have gotten better, I think, at biting the tongue. Very powerful tool, the teeth. And, when I stop and think, which I do often on this, I remember this principle.
Yeah, I mean, I just think of it as like making space to be surprised by what people can pull off, and and the more I can do that, I think the more surprised I am about my family, and people I work with, for sure.
All right, we'll end on that note. Making space to be surprised. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.